Buenas tardes, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a una nueva actividad del Festival Puerto de Ideas Valparaíso, que este año celebra su 10º aniversario gracias al apoyo de Colbún, Copeuch, Fundación Mar Adentro y el Ministerio de las Culturas. Mi nombre es Isabel Behncke, soy antropóloga, evolucionaria y primatóloga. Esta tarde conversaré con la historiadora alemana Andrea Wulf sobre sus investigaciones en torno al magnífico personaje de Alexander von Humboldt y sus propios procesos de escritura como biógrafa de este gigantesco personaje. Esperamos que disfruten mucho la conversación. Good afternoon, dear Andrea. It's so wonderful to have you here.
It is, although I would love to be in Chile, of course, and see this beautiful country, but, you know, we'll make the most of it now, like this, in our new world, in our new reality.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I wanted to tell people that this is the second time we tried to invite Andrea to Chile. Last year she was invited, and of course the activity had to be canceled, and this year it had to be canceled because of pandemic. So we're hoping that the third time next year we are able to have her here in person. But it's wonderful to have you here. Andrea, you are such a meticulous and inspired researcher over anything you put your eyes on. And you have put your eyes on the gigantic character of Alexander von Humboldt. Tell us about him. What called your attention to him? Who was he?
Well, so I'm quite glad I did him like a few years into my career because he was so prolific. But let me start with a few facts. So he was born in 1769, which is the same year as Napoleon. He was a Prussian scientist, the son of a wealthy Prussian aristocratic family, but he left his life of privilege in Berlin, and he went on this extraordinary voyage to Latin America. It lasted for 5 years, and it was a journey that really changed his life, his thinking, and that made him famous across the world. So today, he is almost forgotten in the, at least English-speaking world, but at his time, he was really the most famous scientist. So his contemporaries said that he was the most famous man after Napoleon, for example. He was restless. He was in fact so restless that he said, I feel if I'm chased by 10,000 pigs. So he was relentlessly curious. He pushed his body to the absolute limit. He was the most experienced mountaineer. He was an adventurer. He was a scholar. He was a scientist. And he came back from this journey from Latin America with a new concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today. So that was really why I became interested in him, because he's the forgotten father of environmentalism. So my books are really about the relationship between humankind and nature. So doing a book about Humboldt was very much for me trying to understand why we are how we are today. Why do we destroy nature today? Why do we love nature today? Why are we in this mess we are today? All these things, very often, I believe, we can find in the 18th century of Western societies, where humankind begins to believe that we can control nature. So this is how I kind of came across him, and then I had, very strangely, my agent, who was brought up in Venezuela, my literary agent. He said to me, when I did my very, very first book in 2002, he said to me, well, you are German, you should write about Alexander von Humboldt, because in Venezuela, Humboldt is a superstar. So he had grown up as a boy with these stories about electric eels and jaguars at the Orinoco. And I was then like, oh, no, you know, I'm not ready for a man like Alexander von Humboldt.
You were studying English gardens at the time, right? Which seemed a lot less dangerous than like on the Orinoco.
Well, I have to say, one of the great joys about this book was that if you write a book about an explorer, you have to follow their footsteps. You know, it's essential for the research. So it was like the best excuse to go on crazy, amazing research trips, which were not down to a little beautiful English garden in, you know,
Yes.
Shropshire here or something like that.
Yeah, and you came to South America for the first time because of your research on Humboldt, right?
Yes, and fell completely in love with Latin America, I have to say. So I had never been, and I did all the research for Humboldt before, or a lot of the research, the kind of archival research beforehand, because so Humboldt wrote 50,000 letters, received 100,000 letters, wrote diaries. So there's a lot of material there. So I wanted to, before I came to South America, I wanted to get a little bit of a sense what the structure of the book will be, because I knew I can't write about everything in the same detail. So, and then in 2012, I went to Venezuela to paddle along the Orinoco there. And then I went to Ecuador to climb some of the volcanoes that he had climbed, and that had been so elemental for his vision of nature.
So can we tell people, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because he climbed Chimborazo in Ecuador, and at the time Chimborazo was thought to be the tallest mountain in the world, taller than Everest. And my understanding is that he climbed, and he was very aware of it, he climbed higher than his contemporaries had climbed, and you know, he mentioned that with Lee. But it was difficult, and you climbed Chimborazos too.
Well,
right?
so Humboldt is a total show off. It just, I mean, when you read his letters, there's a lot of competition going on there. So he liked being, you know, the one who climbs the highest mountain in the world. There's a letter I found where he wrote to a friend in Latin America, a long letter, where he describes all the dangers he's encountered. And then the last sentence of that letter is like, and you, dearest, how's your monotonous life? It's a bit of a flawed personality. So for him, so you have to imagine, this is so he climbs Chimborazo in 1802. So he does not have great hiking boots. So in fact, shoes were the biggest problem during that expedition, really, because they had like thin leather soles, they constantly tore. So they were actually climbing Chimborazo with holes in their shoes. And then, you know, they don't have all that, you know, gear we have when we go up a mountain at all. So just the equipment is obviously terrible. And then he is carrying all these scientific instruments with him. You know, he carries 42 scientific instruments through Latin America because he wants to measure everything. So when I went to Chimborazo, I did not have to carry 42 scientific instruments. And I also, because I'm not a mountaineer, I'm a hiker, I knew I'm not going to make it to I wasn't going to go to the peak. So I went to the base camp, which is at 5,000 meters, which was, I have to say, hard enough because I did not drive up there, which a lot of people do. So I walked up there. But for me, feeling these landscapes was incredibly important. I don't know how other authors do that when they write about landscapes they had never seen, but I needed to feel the thin air, for example, in order to appreciate what he was doing. Or I needed to see, I'd never been to the rainforest before, so I needed to feel that sense of also kind of claustrophobic green walls around you. How does that feel? How does this sound? How's this
the
taste?
cacophony of the rainforest, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And you saw Andean condors. You described this beautiful moment where you had 4 condors one moment. And so you had the sense of the grandeur of the Andes and the kind of like the immensity of this landscape.
Yeah, I had this extraordinary moment where so because I was reading his diary and following his footsteps, we found on Antisana, one of the other volcanoes that he climbed in Ecuador, we found the hut in which actually Humboldt had stayed the night at 14,000 feet. And at that very moment, a herd of wild horses turned up. So I was just a little bit, you know, uncomfortable. So suddenly all these horses around me, and then 4 condors were circling above my head. And I had this wonderful guide with me, Juan, and he looked at me and he said, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I have never seen, like, Antisana looked so beautiful because it was foggy in the morning, but then everything lifted. So it was just standing there. And then the horses and the condors. And I think there are only 60 condors in the whole of Ecuador. So It was so spectacular. So that was a really good day of research.
Well, you obviously you have been channeling Humboldt so well, and yeah, maybe the horses and the condors knew something.
Maybe.
I want to ask you something very, very important to me. In your book, you didn't choose just any title. Your title is The Invention of Nature. And of course, people might be going, well, nature was not invented in the late 1800s. What nature presumably was there before. So why did you choose this name, The Invention of Nature? In what sense did Humboldt invent nature?
It's a really good question, because I do actually sometimes get emails from readers who go like, how absolutely outrageous to use this title. Of course, Humboldt did not invent nature, which of course I do know. So it's a little bit of a playful approach. But what I mean with this is that he invented the concept of nature that still shapes our thinking today. So he comes up with this idea that nature is a web of life, that Earth is a living organism, where everything is connected, where everything hangs together in this kind of tapestry of nature. So it's this idea of a web of connection, but also of Earth as a living organism. Because before, and I think that's really important, because we forget that, because we take this concept for granted today. Before, scientists were seeing nature much more like a mechanical system. So it was like a machine. And, we just, or like a divinely created clockwork. And we just had to understand the natural laws. And then we would, understand everything, and everything had its divinely allocated place in this nature. And Humboldt threw all this out and says like, no, this is different. This is a place where everything hangs together, but it moves, it changes, it adapts.
So this is the single most important thing, I think, that Humboldt did for us. And of course, today is so important, but the question arises, how and why? How does the mind come up with something like that? And obviously, to understand that and to get to that, that's why you've been studying him for so many years. But let's talk a little bit about his childhood. Let's delve into the mind that eventually was going to come up with these wonderful insights. How was Humboldt as a child?
So he was brought up in Prussia, in Berlin, which was then quite a military state, quite a kind of a corset of society. And his very loving father died when he was quite young, when he was 9. And his mother was never very maternal or warm, but she gave her 2 sons the best education there was at that time in Prussia. So they were taught by a string of Enlightenment thinkers who really instilled in them the love for knowledge and liberty and truth. And his older brother, Wilhelm, he escaped from this rather unhappy childhood into books of ancient Greek and Rome. And Humboldt did the opposite. Humboldt escaped the classroom. He did not want to read in books about the world. He wanted to experience the world. So he was forever roaming the kind of great forests on the family estate just outside Berlin, and came back with his pockets stuffed with insects and rocks, and he loved to sketch. So he was a really good sketcher. And then the only books he loved were the adventure stories of the great explorers, such as Captain Cook and Louis de Bougainville. And he began to dream of these distant countries. But his mother had very different ideas for his career and said he should be a civil servant in the Prussian administration. And the compromise he found with his mother was that he studied mining. And the reason for that was that as a mining inspector, you are a civil servant, but as a mining inspector, you had to know the latest geological discovery. So it was as close as he could get to science. And then also he had to travel through the whole Prussian territory to investigate all these mining towns and mines. But then he went to a little town called Jena, which is in eastern Germany, and which changed his life really, because he met a lot of very extraordinary German thinkers, including the most famous German poet Goethe. And that became a very important moment for his life, because until then, he was very much a child of the Enlightenment, and he very much approached science as an empiricist. So he would observe nature, he would take data, he would do experiments, he would approach science with rationalism. It would be all scientific. And then he met Goethe, and everything changed, and he began to inject feelings and emotions into his science, which I think then makes him, and we can talk about that a little bit more, but that moment, I think, makes him, this is one of the important moments in his life, which makes him the thinker he becomes later, because he's not just thinking in this linear way. He begins to think kind of in all directions.
Right. But I've always wanted to, I wondered, because I would imagine that the friendship with Goethe, gave him permission to explore and to be in a way that, he said that, he was equipped with organs to see the world, and that these organs were given to him by the friendship with Goethe, and hence the legacy of integrating art and science, right? But nothing comes from nothing, and I would guess he had that in himself, and that it was developed through the friendship with Goethe. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I think obviously someone like Humboldt doesn't grow up in a vacuum. So this is very much what's happening at the time. This is the very early stages of the young romantics who begin to look at nature differently, and they're all in Jena. Just by it's this tiny little town. They're all there. So he's influenced by this, but he's also a child of his time, I suppose. So these ideas are kind of floating around. But I think the other important thing about Humboldt is that what a lot of people said is that he had an incredible memory. So he would literally remember 40 years later the shape of a leaf. I can hardly remember my own books, basically. So he had this extraordinary memory, so he could make these connections. And because he traveled across the world, he was able to say, I have seen something like this in the Alps. Oh, I'm seeing similar plants in the Andes. And I've seen them from a herbarium from Lapland. So why are these alpine plants so similar? So he makes these connections, which I think you have to have a particular mind to do that.
No, right. First you mentioned the wonderful phrase "forever roaming." So forever roaming, to me, it's saying curiosity in big bold. So this hunger, and somewhere you describe, and there's always like a German word that captures things beautifully. The word Fernweh.
Fernweh, sehr gut. Yes. Fernweh is the longing for the distance. Right. Only the Germans have words like this.
In this case, it's not. Usually, it's like a long German word that captures something so beautifully. But the longing for this distance, so that restlessness, that curiosity. Then the friendship with Goethe and the Jena group, so which I would imagine gives him the permission to have the soul of a poet at the same time that the empiricist measuring mind of a scientist, right? And then the memory, his extraordinary memory. But to me, there's one more element that perhaps is what's necessary to bring everything together, that is this visual thinking. That, a linear mind might produce linear thinking, but his mind was not linear. So tell us I'm fascinated about how his mind was like a web itself, and how he put little piece of paper over little piece of paper. How did his mind work?
So one of the things that I loved about this book is, of course, the traveling, but also the traveling into the mind of someone through their manuscripts. So I'm a great believer in original manuscripts, because they tell you so much more than if letters are printed in a book. So when you go to Humboldt's archives in Berlin and you open these boxes, what you see is it is literally like opening a door to his mind, because so take, for example, his lecture notes. So, he writes something down and then he has some ideas and he writes them on bits of paper and glues it on top. And then some of the pieces of paper fold out, and then he reads something in a book and he sticks it on there. So you end up with this multi-layered collage of ideas. How he does his lectures with this, I have absolutely no idea. It's so messy and confusing, when you look at it. But I think it shows us that his mind worked not linear, but in all directions. And when you look at his diary, so he comes back with 4,000 diary pages from South America. And they've been transcribed, and that's all great. But what you really want to see are the drawings in there, because Humboldt, in his person, really brings together the arts and the sciences. He understands this world through data, but also through his pen, through sketching and drawing it. And so in his diary, you have like little drawings of monkeys and maps of rivers and animals and plants and bits of rock, volcano profiles. All of this you find in his diary, because this is how he makes sense of this world. And he comes back and he works together after this trip. He works together with 50 map makers and artists to turn these into lavish engravings, because he believes that nature and science can also be explained visually. So he's also the forgotten father of infographics, because he uses scientific data so visual that it's packed with complex scientific data, some of his engravings, but it's so easy to understand.
Right, but so I guess we have all seen scientists that use art. So say I can study cell biology and have a beautiful drawing of a cell, and also artists that bring in scientific concepts. But what Humboldt did, seems to me, that is much more than just putting art and science together. They were integrated in him, and in doing so, he's creating a new way of thinking. So, for example, when I see his drawings and let's talk about the Naturgemälde, the synthetic drawing he created out of his travels. They're much more than a depiction, an illustration. Yes. He's creating a way of thinking. And the capacity for synthesis there is just extraordinary.
Yes. I mean, so I think that one of the big problems we have today is that we actually divide the world of arts and science with, there's this sharp line in between. Now, at Humboldt's time, that wasn't really the case. The word scientist was only coined in 1834. So this distinction that we have, that we impose on little children when they're 6 years old and go to school today, that didn't quite exist there. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind, because I have the feeling he never had to justify himself as scientists would have to do that now. So what he does is, for example, with the Naturgemälde, which is this, would be nice to show it now, but I'll try to describe it. It is a large 60 by 90 centimeter fold out in the first book he publishes when he returns. And on this basically poster, he drew Chimborazo in cross section. And on Chimborazo, he drew all the plants he had found on his journey there. And he draws it into the mountain at the altitude where he found it. And then to the left and to the right, there are 20 columns, which are filled with data such as gravity, the blueness of the sky he measured, chemical components of the air, humidity, temperature, all drawn into the column at the height where he had measured it. So what you can do is you can trace one line across the whole Naturgemälde, and it gives you all the information there, say, of altitude of 10,000 feet, or I'm mixing feet and meter here, as you can tell. So this for me is the very first piece of infographics, because you get all the information by just looking at it. You don't even have to think really about it.
his mind, in a way, it was extremely modern. I think he seems like a scientist that is living today, and he's creating, not only he thinks in like 3D mind maps that are themselves changing and adapting like trees, but he's creating these synthetic infographics that not only give very good information, but also offer new hypotheses and ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, because the extraordinary thing there is that everything he shows is about connections. So, for example, he also does these maps of, so he's the first to talk about global vegetation and climate zones. Now, we take this for granted today, but that was like at the same time, other scientists were looking through this kind of core set of classification. And Humboldt talked about nature as a global force. So it was not about, taking the temperature in, one place and just tables of numbers. No, this was about the wavy lines that go across our globe that kind of connect places and regions through their climate.
Right. So this is very important. Let's stay here for a second, because I'm fascinated by the difference of what Humboldt did in the sense of how he was connecting and finding pattern, and his emphasis on interactions and global patterns, versus the science of the time that was focused on taxonomy and organization. And I suppose, as somebody that, I studied Darwin and in an English tradition for so long, I get the Linnean obsession with classification. And of course, it's coming from the Enlightenment, and the notion that if we can just order things and organize things properly and just have everything in a tidy little box, then we can comprehend and grasp nature, right? And there he going like, yeah, taxonomy, sure, taxonomy is important, but let's not just look at the things themselves, let's look at the interactions between the things themselves. And that, to me, is his profound genius, no?
Yes, absolutely. And I would also argue that he does that because he travels.
Yes.
He's not sitting with his, herbarium with a dried specimen in, some study, but what he's doing is he's traveling across the world, and because he has this extraordinary memory. So, for example, when he walks up Chimborazo, he realized, so this is a volcano which is pretty much exactly on the equator. So it's a tropical volcano, very different to Vesuvius, for example, in Italy, which is in the northern hemisphere. So as he walked up Chimborazo, he realizes that this is like a botanical journey from the equator to the poles. The higher he comes, the more kind of Arctic plants, the more kind of cold climate plants he's seen, very similar to those which are, in Lapland or Norway. So he makes this connection, and then he, like in the middle, he sees these plants which remind him of the plants he'd seen in the Alps in Switzerland. So he realizes, because he makes these connections, okay, so there's something going on. Then there's another thing where he realizes that the coastal plants of South America and Africa are similar. So he makes that connection. He talks about tectonic plates. He doesn't talk about tectonic plates, but the idea that these continents were together at some stage. So he has this, by observing, he opens a whole new world, because he doesn't observe in the hierarchies that science had functioned in before, but because he has this open mind to see connections.
And because he's using his own body, I would guess that the friendship with Goethe and his own personality made him so attuned to the senses as an exploration tool as well. So that's what, he's obsessed with empirical measurement and his instruments, but the senses, the experience of nature and exploration as methodology, right? So that's very different than scientists that are, hidden in a lab and just looking at their own boxes.
Yeah. So he's well, first of all, he always experiences everything on his body. So he'll drink curare poison, and he'll experiment with dangerous electric eels, and he will rub chemicals and self-inflicted wounds on his body. So he does that. He has his 42 scientific instruments. So he is obsessed with empirical data, but, and I think that's so important, he always says, we also have to use our imagination to understand nature and our feelings. So this is a scientist who's very willing to talk about the wonder of nature, and who will always allow for this sensation to be as important as the empirical data. So it does not just exist, oh, this is the scientific world and this is my emotional world. It belongs together for Humboldt. And I think that is, for me, one of the things that makes him also incredibly relevant today, because that's something we're missing in a lot of political debates. So he's someone who embraces imagination, and he also writes these books which are not for the scientists in the ivory tower, or with that, so complicated that literally no one can understand them. No, his books bring together evocative, poetic landscape descriptions with scientific observations. And with this, I think he creates the blueprint of a lot of nature writing today.
Right. And the ethic of exploration. I mean, the notion, of course, he wasn't like a cerebral scholar that was tucked in only behind his books. But he was this brazen explorer who was like having life-defying moments and danger and suffering. And so that's very genuine. And he's very good at telling the epic of adventure as well. Right?
Yeah, because he is a show-off, and he's an incredible publicist, a self-publicist. So he writes these letters from South America to his friends, and then, describing all the dangers. And then he goes and says, do send it to the newspapers if you like. They can publish this letter. So by the time he comes back in 1804, he's a superhero. I mean, like, everybody has heard about his journeys.
It's like he was Instagramming and Facebooking.
Yeah,
his journey.
But exactly that. Yeah.
Right. No, and let's talk about exploration, because of course, what made him, what I love, and I'm obviously partial about this, is that, his restlessness drove him to have the whole world as a lab, and to use his body as a methodology of learning and the world itself. But then you did too, in studying him. And I just wonder, how has that been for you, given that, today we're stuck indoors, of course, but the notion of the natural philosopher, the notion of the naturalist explorer is one that, is not very common these days, to say the least. And I find it so incredibly productive, not only intellectually, but at a personal level.
Well, you better than anyone else really knows how important it is to be out there with your subjects you are studying, because you learn, it's a give and take. You learn, you understand by being out there. I think by putting your body out there. So for me as a writer, it is that I need to feel these landscapes. I need to also feel the pain a little bit, just to appreciate what he was doing. But it's also that I tried to give it my all to, give Humboldt all the time I had to kind of like study his letters, but I also allowed him to inform me. So my thinking has changed over the past 10 years massively, because I did always think, well, I was really bad at the sciences at school. So I was always put in that box of like, oh, she's artistic and creative and, has no idea about science. And my science teacher were like, she's just a bit stupid, basically. And then, so I think they would turn in their graves if they would see that I'm writing about the history of science. But I think I was taught wrongly, because it was just numbers. And I fell in love with the sciences through the stories of the scientists. So yes. Humboldt has been a great teacher in that respect, but also that he says that we need to use our emotions. So I dare much more now to allow that, to enter that into my work. And that doesn't mean I'm writing something sentimental at all. Everything that I write is based on facts. But we have to all accept that the way we choose our facts and present them, that makes them subjective. They're like, you could read exactly the same sources as I am, but because you are interested in something specific, you will be much more interested about something than I might be. But I also think it allows us to accept that we are humans, and that, I mean, especially right now with lockdowns and stuff like that. So I was locked down for quite a while in Germany, and unplanned, but I had a bit of land there where I just built a vegetable garden out of nothing, and that kept me sane. And I will say that this is the healing of nature. And there's something emotional. There was something incredibly nurturing, in this kind of very discombobulating time to like stick a seed in the soil and see it grow and eat it, eat the salad at the end. And that's something I think I have accepted through Humboldt to become part of also my, say, public persona. So that was always something I admitted to in private, but I would have never said it like now, at a lecture, like, oh yeah, I am driven by a sense of wonder. Yes, that's what makes me tick.
Yeah. So you allowed your study subject to feedback on yourself. I mean, I imagine during the pandemic, especially, you must have been thinking about Humboldt and, what would he have done and what lessons he was giving you and us. And given that, we can't roam at the moment, but you are roaming in your mind perhaps, and you're exploring the senses in different ways, like building a vegetable garden and observing nature.
Well, I think there are two things. One thing is I'm in an incredibly lucky position that as a writer, I'm very much used to working from home, being a hermit. I mean, I'm not always traveling around. I spend a lot of time at home writing. So I'm quite good on my own at home. I do terribly miss the writing. I have to say, the traveling. It just drives me absolutely nuts that I can't just, go to Chile right now, for example. But I think that during the pandemic, what made me realize again how relevant Humboldt was is that, of course, Humboldt has talked about connections, about this tapestry of nature, about this web of life. And of course, that's the whole reason why we are in this pandemic. We know that 75% of all infectious diseases today come from, they cross from animals to humans. And we have destroyed, with agriculture, with logging, we have destroyed biodiversity, we have destroyed natural habitats. So we come into close contact with these animals. So Humboldt, yes, more than 200 years ago, warned about, he said, our human behavior towards nature will shape our future. So, I mean, he is so prophetic. I mean, he predicted harmful human-induced climate change more than 200 years ago.
Tell us a bit more about that, because what we're discussing today, he saw even destructive fishing practices like overexploitation of oysters, and how did he see this in first place? Obviously, he was coming from Europe, which was much more exploited than South America at the time, but he was able to tear apart the influences, correct?
So I think because he arrives in Latin America thinking about nature as this, that it is, he says, I want to find out how all these forces are interactive. So he has already this in mind when he arrives. And then he comes from Europe, which has been, of course, heavily, there was heavy agriculture for 2,000 years, so it's a quite exploited country or continent already. And he arrives in South America, and we think of South America at that time as this kind of, Eden maybe, but the colonists had been there for a long time. So he travels through South America and he sees how humankind destructs nature there. So he sees on the one hand, like lush rainforest, but he also sees how, for example, at Lake Valencia in Venezuela, how plantation owners had completely destroyed the forest there. And it's actually there that he, seeing this destruction, understands the fundamental function of the forest for the ecosystem. He doesn't use the word ecosystem, the term is not coined yet, but he understands that trees, for example, store water, and that trees enrich the atmosphere with moisture, and that they protect against soil erosion. So he sees that, he notes it down, and then he just observes and he talks to the locals and he asks, like, why is this happening? What's happening there? So he's in the Orinoco, for example, and they're deep, deep, deep in the rainforest. And he sees, he speaks to the tribes there, to the indigenous people there, and there's a mission. And once a year, all the turtles come and lay their eggs in the sand at the banks of the Orinoco. And the missionaries collect all the eggs because they use the oil in the eggs to burn their lamps in their, church huts. And the indigenous people talk to Humboldt and say, every year we have less turtles because the missionaries are taking too many. Mm. So he talks to people, and then wherever he goes to, and he's in Mexico, he sees how the local irrigation system in Mexico City has left the surrounding valley completely barren. And in his diary, I found the sentence where he says, I think they're raping nature. So he uses the word raping. So he sees again and again how humankind destroys nature as he travels.
Yeah, Andrea, this is catches so much my attention. He's able to see the harmful effect of humans, but at the same time, seems to be he's very compassionate and curious. He's not the kind of environmentalist that hates people. That we like, John Muir, many of the people he influenced were more human hating than it seems to me that he was. And something that comes very much to the fore is how different he was in relation to indigenous people than other explorers at that time. He did not think that they were savages or below him. Quite the contrary, he obviously understood that they lived there and that they knew better than anyone else. I think he called them like the better observers, the best geographers. So, tell us a bit more about that. I mean, why was he? Yeah. Anyway, tell us more about.
Yeah. So he is. You're right. Unlike most Europeans at that time, he does not see them as barbarians or savages at all. Again and again, he describes them. He admires their observational skills, their botanical skills. I mean, they are the guides who, without them, he's very aware of that. He could have not done what he's done. Unlike other explorers at that time, he's traveling as a private person. He's not traveling on behalf of a government or monarchs. He has a very small team. It's basically him and Bonpland, this French botanist. Then he has his servant José, who's with him the whole time. And then there are a few local guides. That's it. So he's very nimble. He can kind of change his route. When someone says to him, like, there's something really interesting there or there, he can go there. But he also depends on the indigenous people to help him, with food, with guidance, with transport. So and
he's pestering them with questions all the time, almost exactly. to the point that they get impatient with him, right?
He gets sometimes. I mean, we shouldn't forget he is, he's a privileged white man. He is, and he has the money to do so. He bombards them with questions, and he is sometimes like the Western scientist because he wants to know, like, what's the name of this tree? What's the species of this tree, which is a concept they might not have. Or at some stage, he's incredibly frustrated because he realizes after a while that all the different tree names he's written down are just the name for a tree in different languages. So he gets incredibly frustrated about that. He's like, no, that's not what I want. But he notes all the languages. He writes down words. He comes back later and he says that there's no philosophical concept that can not be expressed in the languages of South America. So, which is completely the opposite of what other Europeans are saying, because they said, it's so rudimentary, you can't express anything. And he said, no, you can express abstract ideas with it. They're such sophisticated languages. He's fascinated by the ancient civilization. So he's drawing Inca ruins. He wants to learn everything about Aztec manuscripts. So he's just very open-minded. I think that's the thing. He doesn't approach this world with preconceived ideas such as Europe is better. I mean, it's this idea of the old world versus the new world. And the old world scientists in France, for example, they were talking about the new world as this degenerated continent where everything is just humid and awful and terrible. And Humboldt came back with this portrait of South America that was just glorious and magnificent.
Yeah, he describes and sings South America, and then, of course, inspires from Jefferson to Simón Bolívar, and kind of gives this epic of South America as this wonderful place, right? So so many questions, but for example, I wanted to ask you about some of the key experiences that he has in his travels. So for example, one that I think to us as Chileans, it was very interesting to note was his experience of the earthquake. Because of course, Darwin experienced in Valdivia an earthquake, and if the earth moves and changes, how could organisms not change accordingly? But Humboldt has this experience of the earthquake in Cumaná, obviously before Darwin. And how did that change him? How did that influence him, do you think?
That actually happens very early on because it's the very first place he stays. So that happens after a few weeks in South America, and I think, I mean, I've never experienced an earthquake, but I think most people who have experienced earthquakes say it's a quite profound experience. So he basically says, how can I believe? Until now, I've believed soil is the earth is this solid thing, and with this, I think he allows himself to say, well, if the ground is not solid, then everything I think and believe could be different. So I think it is almost like an earthquake in his mind also, that kind of like tumbles everything together and just goes and says, okay, let's just see how this goes from here. So I think that was an incredibly important moment for him. I do think that climbing Chimborazo was elemental for his vision of nature, because he's halfway in his journey, so he's seen already quite a lot. He's climbed a lot of volcanoes, because he essentially walks from Bogota to Lima, 4,000 kilometers. So, and this is, and he climbs every reachable volcano. So when he stands what he thinks to be the top of the world in Chimborazo, his vision of nature clarifies, and everything that he's seen before kind of falls into place. So I think that's very important. Mm-hmm. I do think that the rainforest is very important for him. The paddling along the Orinoco, 1,400 miles, 2,500 kilometers, where it's dangerous. They almost starve to death. They, almost drown, all of these things, but they also encounter the richest, most magnificent web of life on our planet. And he just pursues all these different threats he's seen there. So I think, once you've been in the rainforest, you understand the web of life so much better, because it's just buzzing. And
so Humboldt experienced the rainforest, and experiencing the rainforest is, I think, experiencing the web of life. Everything is being born and eaten and interacting. And on one hand, he experienced the rainforest, but then he was also in Chimborazo. And when you're on a mountain, you have perspective. It seems to me that the epiphany he had there was, I would translate it today as like the birth of modern complexity science. Complex adaptive systems is the lens through which we are understanding dynamic nature. It evolves, so that's the history of deep history that Darwin gave us, but it also interacts and creates. It's incredibly modern. Would you agree that Humboldt is perhaps the father of complexity science?
Yeah, I absolutely would. I think it's almost like if his mind is like a mini computer already. So he because I think that's because of his memory, because he can make these connections, but also because, so for example, if we just think about climate, until Humboldt, scientists who talked about climate, they talked about the weather. They talked about the temperature, maybe the humidity. But Humboldt suddenly goes and says, no, we have to look at land mass, for example. Where do we measure? Are we inland? Are we on top of a mountain? So he begins what he calls comparative climate studies. All of that, and then he says, this is, so we have to think about climate, we have to think about geology, we have to think about vegetation, which then, of course, becomes very interesting for people like Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin. So yeah, I absolutely do think that he is the father of complexity science, 100%.
And the intellectual father of Charles Darwin himself, right? I mean, Darwin has this wonderful quote that he almost knew by heart the writings of Humboldt, and that's what inspired him to go on the Beagle, right?
Yeah. So I for me, this is one of my favorite bits, because, there's so many people, saying like Darwin is like, we are all standing on Darwin's shoulders. And I think, well, but Darwin is standing on Humboldt's shoulders. And that's forgotten. And one of the reasons I think that Humboldt's forgotten today is that he does not have like the theory of evolution connected to his name. That's what Darwin has. But Darwin, as a young man, read Humboldt's books. One book which was called Personal Narrative, which is basically partly a travel account, partly a scientific treatise of the travels. And it's this book where he combines poetic landscape descriptions with hard scientific data. So Charles Darwin reads it as a young man and says, like, that book changed everything for me. That book made me want to travel to South America. So he goes on the Beagle, and on the Beagle, he has a tiny little shelf next to his hammock. And on this shelf, he puts his Humboldt books. And amazingly, these books still exist today in the archive at Cambridge University. So you get them out and you see how Darwin has written all over them. I mean, he read them with pen in hand. It's like underlined, stuff is written in the margins. And it's almost, reading them is almost like listening to Darwin having a conversation with Alexander von Humboldt, because Humboldt inspired him and influenced him in so many ways. So, for example, it was Humboldt's books who made him go to South America. Once he was in South America, he actually, at the beginning, tried to understand or make sense of this new world through the lens of Humboldt's writings. So he's rereading Humboldt's adventures as he travels through South America. He models his own voyage of the Beagle very much on Humboldt's personal narrative, so stylistically very similar. As Darwin later is then working on his evolutionary theory, he uses Humboldt's books to find examples, and Humboldt is later called a pre-Darwinian Darwinist by his friends. So you see how Darwin underlines sentences like the transmutation of species, or Humboldt describes in one scene, which I love, where he describes how capybaras are held in check. The population of capybaras is held in check by jaguars. And Darwin writes in the margins, he writes, "What a positive check." So you have it in the nutshell, in pencil. You have like the theory of natural selection written by Darwin in pencil in Humboldt's books.
But that to me it really fills me with awe, because we could also see so clearly the connections between the thinkers and the explorers themselves. So and it makes me feel that I really want to help you restore Humboldt, fame today. First of all, because he deserves it. We often talk about that the greatest. Somebody said the greatest idea I ever thought was Darwin's, because it was the idea of the unity of life through common descent. But Humboldt gave us the idea of the unity of life through interaction, through being the web of life. And Darwin is the son of that, right? I think so, yeah. But I wanted to ask you about the intellectual ancestor of both. because Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, was, Humboldt admired him, but also he himself was an early evolutionist. He was this eccentric character that had developed this coat of arms was like concha et omniae, everything comes from the sea. And he inspired the romantic poets and William Blake and Coleridge as Humboldt did. And of course, he was doing these dinners where he would bring scientists and poets and philosophers. So, Darwin comes from that, but I think there's a direct line that we can draw between Humboldt and Erasmus Darwin as well, no?
Yeah, because in a way they are, Humboldt is exactly in between Erasmus and Charles in a way, I think. And he read Erasmus Darwin, and Erasmus Darwin writes a poem called Love of the Plants, in which he basically translates Linnaean classification into verse. So you have all these like lovesick flowers and horned snails and worms and it's exactly that. Is that this what we today call romantic science, which was still very much based on empirical scientific research, but it was allowed an emotional component to it, and Erasmus Darwin definitely does that, and in a way Charles Darwin also does it, but he kind of doesn't really put it into his writings so much, while Humboldt, I think, is not really afraid of that. But I also think it has to do that he dies in 1859, so this is when scientists become so specialized and crawl into the narrow disciplines. And he's really the last of the great polymath.
I mean, that was the year that The Origin of Species was published.
Yeah, he misses it by a few months. It was published in November and Humboldt dies in May, so just by a few months.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that we need Humboldt and romantic science in that sense. And now almost more than ever, no? With the complex challenges that we have.
Yeah, I mean, for me, because in a way, I mean, it's interesting to work on a historic figure, but I wouldn't work on a random historic figure. It has to be someone who has some relevance for me today. And I think for me, Humboldt, and that's something I've learned through him. This is not how I started this book at all, but when I look at today's environmental debates in the political arena, at least, that I'm really missing that no one dares to talk about the awe of nature. So everybody, we have like scientists and politicians all throwing around these numbers, but no one says like, well, we are actually only going to protect what we love. So let's get to the bottom of that. So I think it's not just geoengineers and scientists who can, get us out of this mess. I think we need equally artists and poets and writers who tell these stories, who make us excited, who let us be in awe of nature, who will get another generation of kids out into nature. Because I think, it's this idea of, we talk about the rising acidity of oceans, but I think we also need to talk about how absolutely beautiful a wild ocean is. What does that do to my soul? And Humboldt said, what speaks to my soul escapes my measurements.
Yeah.
And I think that, and so if someone like Humboldt, who is such a pernickety, meticulous scientist on the one hand, and on the other hand, stands there and, gets so excited when he for the first time sees the Pacific Ocean, for example, from the Andes near Lima. So if someone like Humboldt can do that, I think we can also do that, because he talks about that nature is in this mysterious communication with our feelings. And I think we have to allow ourselves to do that, because that's where our imagination comes from, 10,000s of generations ago. So our DNA is our imagination that was shaped in nature.
Right. We evolved in nature, and our aesthetic preferences were shaped by it too.
Yes.
In terms of our cognition and being like healthy animals, what you're saying is so important. Humboldt, of course, influenced so many people, and what you're saying reminds me of John Muir's quote, you hitch, wait, I had written it somewhere. In nature, you pick up one thing and you find it hitched to everything else in the universe, right? This kind of like untangling of the web of life. I think Humboldt has...
that John Muir has that idea from Humboldt, basically.
Yes.
And this is how, in a way, I think one of the reasons why Humboldt is so forgotten today is because we take this idea for granted. We don't even think that someone has come up with this idea, because it's just the way we function and think. So I think in a way, every environmentalist, every nature writer today, even if they've never heard of Humboldt, they are still connected to him through this kind of rope.
He's our ancestor, whether we are aware of it or not. It is almost like he was like transmuted, reincarnated in the web of life himself.
Yeah, right? by osmosis, he kind of goes
exactly. He's reigning, and he's in the Andes, and he's in the condors. Right. Well, I can't wait for having another opportunity to keep talking with you, Andrea. What the work that you have done is just extraordinary. You have so much to give us and to teach us about Humboldt and the way he saw the world, and and your own process of discovery, allowing yourself to be changed and permeated by this research as well. So, we are here in Latin America, which was changed by having explorers and thinkers from all over the world. But Darwin and Humboldt, they gave, I would say, the ideas of the unity of nature. And I hope we can, travel and go up the mountains with you sometime.
Yes, please, because Latin, they came back being shaped by Latin America, those two men. I've definitely also been shaped by my travels through Latin America. So Chile is waiting on my list.
The Andes Mountains are waiting for you.
Yeah, they're shouting for me.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an enormous pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
and I hope
you
to
so
see
much.
you in person next time. Thank you, Andrea.
Bye.
Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Los invito a seguir disfrutando y reflexionando con la 10ª versión del Festival Puerto Ideas Valparaíso. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.